Hey guys, Cade Wilcox here, host of the Primitive Podcast. Thank you for joining today's episode. Today we have Drayton McLane. Drayton McLane is a business owner, a great, amazing leader, owned the Houston Astros for 19 years, sold his company to Walmart, and is still at 84 years old doing amazing things. It's the second time I've had a chance to be around Drayton and listen to his wisdom, and every time I learn something new, I'm impacted greatly. And someone I really admire. An interesting thing about Drayton, in each occasion that I've met with him, within 2 to 3 days after being with him, I get a handwritten card from him, and it's personalized. And it's something I really admire about him. And the reason I share that is I think it says a lot about who he is and the way he leads, and he's been doing that for a long time. And so, like me, I'm certain you're going to learn and appreciate a lot about this episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Well, Drayton, it's a real pleasure to have you on my podcast. A couple of years ago, we had you at one of our young leadership events, and it was the largest one we've ever had. I personally really enjoyed it. I know a lot of other people did. Probably the thing that impacted me the most, though, is you sent me a handwritten card a couple of days after the event, and on the front of the card it said, "Let your imagination get in the way at least once a day." And you didn't know this about me, but my favorite thing to do is dream. So when someone I respect like you sends me a card that says, "Let your imagination get in the way," it was kind of permission to do that. And it made a huge impact on me. And even the first line in your card said, "Creative leadership is one important part of life, and you get an A+." And those words made a huge impact on me. I have that card right by my computer. I see it every day. And so I wanted to thank you for doing that and tell you the impact it had on me even 2 years, into it. And so I really appreciate you being on the podcast with me this morning.
Well, thank you, Kate. It's an honor to be here again. And I still remember that evening in Lubbock. That was a lot of fun. And what was really engaging is the average age. That was a young group of people. Too often we go to meetings, we have people that are like I am, or over 60 or over 70 years of age. You had I felt young the evening I was there.
Man,
so
that's great.
Honored to be there and be engaged with you.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so if you don't mind, spend a few minutes kind of talking about your background, like where you grew up and how you got into business, and a little bit about your business for our audience that may not be familiar with who you are.
Okay, I'm Drayton McLane. I was born in Cameron, Texas. Cameron, Texas is in central Texas, near Temple, Texas. It was a small town of 5,000, but I grew up in the town, had two of the finest Christian parents, had two older sisters, and our parents really kept us engaged. They kept us under control. And my mother said something to me, but she also said to my two sisters hundreds of times, that one of the most important parts of your life is who you select to be your friends. And she said, choose your friends wisely. Choose people that have value, have integrity, people that want to accomplish things, and choose them wisely, and your life will soar. Well, as I was growing up, and particularly as a teenager, she would call me in many times and said, "I'm not sure you were really selecting good friends." And she would give me some corrections on who I selected as my friend, because she knew everyone in town. Later, when I graduated from high school, I went to Baylor University. And so I was 70 miles away. And I remember I was at Baylor as a freshman. I was gone for about 6 or 7 weeks. And I came home for the first time. The very first thing my mother did said, "Son, I want you to sit here and tell me about your new friends." Said, "I don't know any of them, but I want you to share with me who you really have enjoyed getting to know." So I've tried to practice that throughout my life. So grew up in Cameron, graduated from high school there, went to Baylor, which was 70 miles away, had a great, great Christian experience at Baylor, and graduated in 1958. And then I went to Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan, and got an MBA. A lot of people asked me, he said, how did a kid in the 50s go all the way to Michigan State. Well, Michigan State had one of the really early, outstanding MBA programs. It was in the top 10, okay, and emphasis on logistics, which I was interested in. So when I graduated from Baylor, I then went to East Lansing, spent 2 years there getting an MBA, and then I came back in late 1959, and my father was in the wholesale grocery business. And he was doing about $2.5 million in sales in 1959. He was distributing groceries in about a 50-mile radius. My grandfather had actually started the business in 1894.
Wow.
My dad, when he got out of college in 1921, he went to work for his dad. So in 1959, I went to work for my dad. I'd always wanted to be a businessman. I admired my dad, and I wanted to be a strong entrepreneur.
So, let me interrupt you. So did you, growing up, did you talk to your dad a lot about that? Like you just mentioned how you admired your dad, you wanted to be a businessman. I have an 8-year-old son, and so he's watching what I'm doing on a daily basis. And that's working a lot. And so do you remember growing up and like watching your dad, and like, did y'all have conversations about that? I mean, what was that like for you?
My father, when I was going to school, so your son has one more year. When I was 9 years old, when I got out of school in May at the 9th year, he let me have a week off, and then he would get me up at 6:15 every morning, and I'd go to work with him.
Wow.
Job was working in the warehouse. I was sweeping. I wasn't doing anything sophisticated, but I did that every summer, worked there. My dad never, I admired him for this, never pushed me in any way, said, son, you would be the third generation, would like for you to come in the business. He never mentioned that to me. Appreciated that. When I got out of Michigan State, there were 72 in my class there, the MBA program, and most of them were in their early 30s. They'd had a lot of experience. I was 22. I didn't know a great deal. And about my highest qualification was driving a truck for my dad. And so the MBA program was very broadening. It really, it was a great maturing process for me. I grew up and went to Baylor, which was, kind of connected. And all of a sudden I went 1,000 miles away, didn't know one person there. And that was a great maturing. I had to succeed on my own. So I came back and I told my dad that I had a job working for Kraft Foods in San Francisco. I was going to go to San Francisco. And then in 5 or 6 years, I'd like to come back and go to work for him. And my father said something interesting. He said, son, that's a decision you need to make. But in 5 years, I'm not sure this business is going to be worth coming back to. Said, I really haven't modernized it in the last few years. It needs to be modernized. And so if you're not interested, I'll probably either sell it or liquidate it in the next few years. But if you want to stay, I'd love for you to come back and get involved. But you need to decide that now. So here in my mind, after going to school for 6 years, I was off to San Francisco. I was single. Life was great.
Yeah.
And I went home that night, and that was a very restless night. And I said, how many people would give their right arm to have an opportunity of business doing $2.5 million, was employing about 65 people, and had a start. So on the next day, I went back, couldn't wait to see my dad. I said, Dad, I've changed my mind. I'd like to go to work for you. The biggest smile on his face. Until the day before, he had never talked to me about coming to work for him.
Wow.
So excited. And I said, well, great, Dad. He had a little over 60 employees. And I thought I was going to be his number one assistant. I said, what will be my first job? And he said, son, you're going to work on the third shift at night loading trucks. And it just crushed me. Here I took a trip to San Francisco and living there. And I said, Dad, I've been to college for 6 years. He said, son, that doesn't qualify you for anything we do here.
Wow.
I learned it from the ground up. Well, I appealed to my mother, and my mother said, that's between you and your father. So my father left people on the third shift at night. And that was the best lesson I could have had. I learned to appreciate people who do the work.
Mm.
And these people knew the business. They taught me of the steps the business went. And later, as I was trying to manage the business, I could understand how I could make corrections because I saw how it worked. So that was the best thing that ever happened to me, is working that 18 months on the third shift at night, getting to know.
That's awesome. So where did it go from there? Like how long did your dad continue in the business before you kind of were elevated to a leadership role?
Well, that was in 1959, in late 1959. About he after I worked on the third shift, I did other work in the distribution center, and then I got involved with sales, and he let me work through various parts of the business. And in about 1964, that I began to take different responsibilities and assumed more and more overall responsibilities of the business. And it was still a distribution center that had not changed much. They didn't have a forklift. They didn't have pallets. They modernized the business. And so I wanted, and it was in a warehouse that my grandfather had started. My dad had expanded it many times, but it was an old warehouse. And so I went to my dad one day and I said, Dad, if this warehouse burned down, by then there were about 80 employees. I said, the only people that would be disappointed would be you and I. Most of these people are minimum wage workers and they could get a job somewhere else. We'd be the disappointment. I want to be in a business where if it burned down, everybody would be devastated. Said, how are we going to start all over? And they'd be fired. And I said, we needed to build a new distribution center. And he said, well, that's a good idea. I said, why don't you think it through and come up with a plan? So I came up with a plan to build a new distribution center. Cameron, where we were, was a town of about 5,000, and it was 35 miles from Temple. At that time, Temple had about 30,000, and then Waco was about 60 miles away, and Austin was about 70 miles away. So I told my dad, I said, we ought to build a new distribution center, but because of the investment, we shouldn't put it in Cameron. We should put it in Austin, Waco, or Temple. You see, I was prejudiced again. I was still single. Awful excited. And then if Austin didn't work, Waco or Temple. So he said, well, let me think about it. And he asked me how much did I think it would cost to build that. And I got with an architect and we found out we wanted to build about a 45,000 square foot distribution center. And this was in 1965. And we found that it was going to cost about $700,000. And my dad said, wow. Our business at that point had a net worth of about $400,000. Mm. And I told my dad, and he said, well, son, that's a pretty big investment. He said, we would have to go in debt if business had no debt. He said, we'd have to go into debt. And at that time, my dad was 64 years old and my mother was a year younger. And he said, we could liquidate the business or sell the business and we'd have $400,000 or $500,000 and we could live comfortably, but we'd have to go into debt. And he said, well, let me think about it. The next day he said, your mother and I have talked about it. And if you're willing to stay and do this, we're willing to move forward. And he said, but you can't build it in Austin and you can't build it in Waco. You'd have to go. My heart sunk a little bit. I just thought for my mother and dad that were in their middle 60s, they had comfort in a state there and they were willing to risk it all. Mm. That's what entrepreneurs need to do at times. And I swallowed hard. But one other caveat my dad said, now, son, we're willing to risk this, but he said, I want a commitment from you. And I thought, yeah, you bet. And he said, if we build it in Temple and it's not as much fun as you think it is, it's not as easy, or you get discouraged, I don't want you to hand it back to me, my age, and tell me I've got to pay off this debt. He said, it's your responsibility. And I said, Dad, I don't care if it takes me 70 years. I'm responsible. And so we built a new distribution center and moved into it in 1966. By then we were doing about 8 million. And so we moved it in 66 and then I moved to Temple. My dad continued to commute, but he entrusted me. So I really started running the business about 1964 and 65. Changing the business, I put a computer in that back in 1964. I computerized the business, and that really drove him. But he trusted me to do that. Yeah. The employees thought it was a tragedy. Everybody in town thought, computers were just emerging.
Wow.
And they thought, boy, this guy. I remember a friend of my dad told him one day, said, a lot of people called him D, and his name was Drayton also. And he said, D, you know what the biggest mistake you ever made? He said, what was that? He said, you should have never sent that kid to college.
That's great.
But don't you hear that today in some of the things? You do, even though we're so technical, there are new ventures out there in technology. People think, why do that? Why not just stay with where you are? But you can't stay still in business. You got to constantly, and you talk about dreaming. I love to dream too, and you have to have dreams.
So fast forward a little bit. So you obviously took over the business. It rapidly grew. And so what was that experience like? I mean,
Well, we moved to Temple, and our format then was we sold small rural grocery stores in small towns like Cameron and others, but big supermarkets were certainly growing. Safeway was very dominant in Texas at that time. H-E-B was a strong retailer that's very strong today, and other big supermarkets were taking a big end of the business. We were servicing small stores, and you think we're so smart and we're so strategic in that, but I say baloney most of the time. One night I stopped at a 7-Eleven store to buy something, and it wasn't in the store, and the clerk that night, I said, well, you don't have this item? He said, no, we got a lot of out of stock. We got a very poor supplier. And I said, who are you buying from? And he said, from a wholesaler in Houston, Texas. And I said, well, who should I talk to? Who is your boss? And he gave me, I can remember his name, and this was about 1967 or 68. He said his name was Alton Lang, and he was a district manager in Temple for 6 or 8 7-Elevens. So couldn't wait till the next day. So I called Alton Lang, and he said, yeah, I've heard of you. And I told him I'd like to start supplying the store. And he said, well, it's not that simple. He said, all the decisions on who 7-Eleven buys from is made in Dallas. And I thought, wow. And he said, we sure need a good supplier, but I can't make a decision like that. I have to buy from whom they tell me. So he told me, and he told me the merchandise manager was Pete Exline. Well, this was, as I said, about 1968. And so I thought, oh, here's a great opportunity. So I pulled down the book in Baylor. I took a course in business letter writing. Or take one in something like that. And I pulled down my book, and I bet I spent an hour writing a letter to Pete Exline. I really did a good job. And I mailed it. About 6 or 7 days back, I got crushed. I got a letter from 7-Eleven, and it was my original letter. That's what really ticked me off. He sent my letter back and wrote on the bottom of the letter, not interested. Excellent. I was crushed.
Wow.
So I thought, I'm not going to let that rascal get the best of me. So I decided the first of every month, I would write him an original letter again, putting different items in. And I sent 7 of them. Never heard a word from him. One day my phone rang and said, McLane? And I said, yes, sir. He said, Exline. That was it. He said, you're going to be in your office in the morning. I said, yes, sir. He said, see you in the morning.
Wow.
So I wrote him 7 letters, per word. And he came down, and we negotiated, took a period of time, but we started supplying 64 7-Elevens in Waco, Temple, Belton, Killeen, and Austin. That got us really focused on the convenience store industry, and we really started capitalizing on that. And from that forward, for 32 consecutive years, McLane Company grew in sales 30% or more for 32 years. And so we started accentuating it in the convenience stores and other forms of grocery logistics. So it all started, it wasn't my brilliant. I just stopped in that 7-Eleven one night and it started. So, you know, you're a whole lot smarter than I am. Boy, you can see these things sometimes, but it's a series of events that occur. You got to follow up on them and don't get discouraged.
Yeah, it's powerful. So there's two other things I want to cover in your experience, just because I find them really fascinating. How does one start aspiring to own a Major League Baseball team? So I would love to hear that story. And then I would love to hear and catch up on your high-speed rail project and, you know, how someone starts, again, you know, these are big things. Like the everyday person doesn't just kind of wake up and think about these things. And I would love to hear how those originated in your mind and you know, yeah, just the whole process around those two things.
Okay, you're talking about Major League Baseball, and then you're talking about high-speed rail. I was in the grocery logistics business, and I can get that's more exciting than owning a baseball team. People have asked from time to time, would you rather continue on a baseball team or be in grocery logistics? I said, that's easy, grocery logistics. I remember one time I was on an airplane, and a lady was sitting by me, and she said, what do you do? And I told her that I was in the food logistics business, and she looked at me and said, I bet that's boring. Unloaded on her. She was glad when we finally got to Dallas. I was telling her, I can get so excited. So whatever you do in life, I can get so excited about food logistics. And it's complicated, and it's doing it efficiently and doing it low cost. So whatever you're doing in life, get excited, get fired up over it. You asked of how I got into the baseball business. Well, it's kind of like how I got into supplying convenience stores. There was a group of supermarkets that we worked with in Houston called Randall's. And they were owned by an individual named Bob Armstead, who was a very creative guy. And I had a lot of admiration, spent a lot of time with him. And then Ben Love, the biggest bank in Texas at that time was called Texas Commerce. And Ben Love was the CEO, the president and CEO of Texas Commerce. So one day, again, my phone rang, and it was Bob Armstead and Ben Love on the phone and said, Drayton, we got a big idea we'd like you to participate in. I said, great. And they said, we're thinking about buying the Houston Astros. Astros had been owned for several years by an individual in New York City named John McMullen, and said, we've been negotiating and we have 4 others. And so we would like for you to come join us, and you be the 6th, and you be engaged with us on this project. Shows you my vision. I said, I'm having too much fun in the whole grocery business. I really don't have any interest in doing that whatsoever. And I said, I think I'm gonna hang up on you, but I wasn't, because one of them was my customer and the other one was my buyer. So I wasn't gonna hang up on them. And they said, well, why don't you come down and sit in a meeting? And just out of respect for them, I drove to Houston and had the other partners, and we negotiated with John McMullen. And John was feisty, he was aggressive, and he was provocative, and they were attacking him and he was attacking them. And we had 5 or 6 negotiating sessions and just got nowhere. And I remember Bob Armstead called me one day and said, Drayton, Ben and I have decided that we're just going to back out. This is not good. We can't make a good deal with John McMullen, and we're just going to cancel the whole thing. And I said, okay. Then I got thinking about it. I said, you know, I've really gotten fascinated about this baseball deal, and I'd like to look into it. So I called Bob and Ben back and said, I've gotten fascinated. Do you all object if I tried to negotiate with John McMullen on my own? And at that stage, I had been to 3 major league games in my entire life. So I was, and they said, boy, if you're that big a fool, go ahead. So I called John McMullen, and he said, okay, McLane. He said, why don't you fly to New York? And he said, the Astros are actually playing the Mets. Well, my youngest son, his name is Denton McLane. He was 14 years old. He was a fanatical New York Mets fan. He knew more about baseball than I did. So I flew to New York with my 14-year-old son. We went to a game with John McMullen and didn't sat in on the negotiation session. But I always find you don't attack people. You try to work through them. You recognize them. You see how you can get mutual benefits for each party and get it done. And out of 3 sessions, I bought the Houston Astros by myself. And I've been to 3 games in my entire life.
Yeah. Wow. How long did you own the Astros?
For 19 years.
19 years. Wow.
A lot of fun. So I stayed in the grocery business and continued to live in Temple, took an apartment in downtown Houston. So I spent about half my time with the Astros and half the time in McLane businesses. And it was interesting, it was fascinating. And in business, just my personal, I think we stayed too confined in one area. And I knew thousands of people and business leaders in the food industry, but I didn't know a lot of people outside of the food business. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to do that, to get to know other people. So I would challenge people. It's not for everybody, but somewhere at the time I bought the Houston Astros, I was 57 years old. So I might have thought, boy, he's an old guy and needs to go retire. But I think it's good to get very secure when you have a successful business. You get very secure at it. And you get more conservative. And you don't use creativity, and you cease to become a risk taker that you were in the early part of your career. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to do it. I said, I want to do something that I'm really not totally sure what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that story. So it's really good. I want to shift, if you're okay, and I'm just going to ask you a series of questions about leadership, and I'm really curious, just to hear from you and learn from you. So the first one is, what do you believe are the primary responsibilities of any leader of an organization or whatever? Like, when you think of leadership, what are the 2, 3, or 4 things that are, you feel like are essential for any leader?
I think to be a good leader, you got to know yourself. Too many people hop in, they've got a lot of technical knowledge or that, but they really don't know themselves. So number one, I think you need to sit down. And it's what I tried to do in my early 20s. Write down who you are and what you want to do. And number one, the most important is write down your integrity. Who you are, what are your values? In my case, it was my Christian belief and honesty and integrity and high Christian principles. I keep those on cards that I put in my pocket. And I look at those, so as you get into a situation, look back to what your values are and say, no, I can't do that. That violates my values. So number one, know yourself, know your values. And early on, I was not married. Then later, I was married. And then I had 2 sons. And then put your family in the right perspective of where they fit into your life. Don't put them over here that you'll pay attention to them later on. And weekly, I worked very hard in my business, but I would give time during the week and the weekend to my family. And so write down your values and write down who you are and what your integrity is all about. My father early on did something that was a great benefit to me, and I'd like to share it with you. As he was developing me in the grocery business there in Cameron, he said he had 2 friends. He said, pretty soon you're going to know everything we do here, and you're going to fall in a trap, and you just keep doing it. So he sent me to see a wholesale grocer in Florida and one in Illinois. And in both places, I saw some things they were doing. It was pretty good. I came back, and I put those in our business. Well, those 65 employees said, this kid's pretty good. He came up with this idea. I didn't come up with that. I saw that in Florida. So he said, son, you need to have mentors. And I think I mentioned this when we were in Lubbock that night. Throughout my career, I'm 83 years old, and I still have mentors. You need to have somebody that gets you out of the day-to-day flow of your business and makes you think differently. And I had several rules for my mentors. It was easy for me. They got to be smarter than you are.
Yeah.
But most people, you know, if we're going to go have dinner tonight or have lunch with somebody, or on the weekend in particular, we go with people we have fun with, people that make us feel good. My mentors didn't make me feel good. They turned me upside down many times. So I said, they're smarter than I am. They couldn't be a relative of any kind or anyone associated in my business. Mm. And the reason for that, they need to tell you really who you are and where you're messing up and what you need to do. And you go to them, and two mentors I had a plan. I couldn't bring an agenda to them that I wanted to talk about. They brought it to me, or they would just take the current events, whatever's going on big in the world that day, is what he said we should talk about.
Yeah. Wow.
And it develops your thinking process. It makes you see bigger things, and it gives you a great deal of confidence. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage to you and to people, get you a mentor, but get him away from your family, your business, and then go spend. I didn't spend a great deal of time. I'd go spend them like I'd go see. I had one in Chicago, and I'd fly to Chicago and get there at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and we'd have dinner that night. We'd probably talk to 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. We'd have breakfast the next morning, and then I'd leave. Wow. And it would just change your thinking. Mm. It gives you a bigger perspective. So I really encourage you. So get a mentor, and then get goals. You got to get goals. I'm a big believer in goals, and my goals are generally weekly goals. Mm.
That's powerful. Thanks for sharing that. Very, very good. Well, how do you treat failure? You know, when you think back on your successful career, certainly you've had plenty of successes, but what about the failures? Like how have you personally treated failure throughout your career?
If you're going to be an entrepreneur, you're going to make mistakes. Yeah. Don't let mistakes bother you. We all make mistakes, and own up to your mistakes. If you'll look at leaders that have made mistakes, those that owned up to them quickly said that was my responsibility. I remember President John Kennedy, when he and his group were organizing the invasion of Cuba that failed. Embarrassment. He went on TV and said it was my responsibility. I approved it, and I accept the responsibility. The world forgave him of it. It's the ones that try to hide and blame somebody else or say it's not my fault. So don't be afraid to make a mistake. Can I give you my 3 rules?
Yeah, absolutely.
I encouraged our executives, and I had 3 rules. I said, number 1, you can never violate a law, and you can't violate your personal integrity or the person you're dealing with. You can't violate the law or integrity. Number 2, whatever you're doing, don't bet the company store on it. If you only got $1 million, invest $200,000. Set $700,000 aside. Number 3, if it fails and blows up, make sure you're still alive. You didn't disappear when it exploded. So if it blew up and you're over the side and it blew all the clothes off of you and singed your hair and all that, you're in great shape. You didn't bet the store on it. You still got $700,000 over here, and you didn't violate your integrity, or you didn't violate any law. You're in great shape. And you learn more from your failures than you do your successes. You learn what doesn't work. Discouragement. In Major League Baseball, I remember one time we gave Carlos Lee, was from Panama, was a great hitter, and we gave him a 6-year contract for $100 million. Think about this. We only wanted him to succeed 3 times out of 10. So in baseball, you fail more than you succeed.
Yeah.
And he was making $30 million a year. And so we only wanted him to succeed 3 out of 10, and he's a hero. So don't let mistakes bother you. Accept responsibility. You're still in good shape, and move on.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you for sharing that. It's really good. What I've been around you, what I've heard about you from people who know you well, you're a faithful Christian, you're a faithful husband, you're a faithful father, and by pretty much all measures, a successful business person. And what I would be curious to hear in your perspective is, like, throughout your life, how have you managed aspiration with your responsibility, your love, and your affection for the Lord, for your family? Like, I always experience that tension, right? And I'm curious, like, how you approached managing being really driven in your aspirations and wanting to succeed, but also being responsible and being present and being engaged with things that really matter to you, specifically your faith and your family. So what's your advice there, and how did you manage that?
That's a complicated question.
It is, isn't it?
I'd like to revert back when I said, get to know yourself. What's important to you? And write it down. Write it, remember when you were in second or third grade, they said if you write it down, your
Yeah.
ability to remember it is much stronger. So write down your values and what's important to you and where your family fits into it. And don't just the family total. You got to spend some time with your wife alone, of where she feels a part of what you do. And then you certainly need to spend time as a family unit with your children and individually with your children. And you do that. You need to spend time in your business. And that will be the vast majority of your time. And then you need some personal time to feel good. Ken Cooper, Dr. Ken Cooper, when he wrote the book Aerobic in 1968, I read the book in Aerobic, and it talked about running and talked about running a mile. I thought, well, that was in 68, and I was in my late 20s, or I was 30. And I thought, well, I can run a mile. I went out and I couldn't even run more than 100 yards. Well, I'm going to get in shape. So I started running. I have run since 1968. I've run 3 to 4 times a week. I don't run competitively against other people, and I prefer to run by myself. That's how I clear my. People think running to help my heart and all that. I guess you do. I was running mentally. You finish running a mile or 3 miles, and I generally do it at 5:30 in the morning. I would feel like $1 million.
Yeah. And
I'd run a mile, and I would run in my neighborhood. And you know what, Doc? Maybe in that neighborhood, there were 3,000 people. I was the only one out there running. That makes me feel good. I was doing something nobody else was doing.
Yeah.
And it gives you a sense of accomplishment. So whatever you do, play golf, play tennis, do something by yourself that you feel good about, and it helps you. So prioritize your work there, and then set goals in each one of those areas.
Man, that's good. Thank you. I just got 2 more questions for you. One of them is, how do you stay inspired? Again, you've had all this success. You're at the end of your career, not the beginning of your career, and you're still energetic. You still have vision. How do you continue to stay inspired and engaged and empowered when if I could just be candid, many people your age have hung it up 20 years ago, and you haven't. And I'd be curious, like, how have you stayed inspired and engaged and continuing to contribute a really meaningful leadership?
Do you ever step back and think where you were and where technology was 10 years ago? Technology is. Look at our lifestyle today, what we can achieve, what we can do, what medical science has achieved today. And I want to run with the first team. When you were in grade school, you wanted to be on the first team and all the way through your life. So I want to run with the first team. So you have to keep up with technology. You need to keep up with new patterns of what's happening in the political world. And so I try to set goals and stay engaged, and I let others take the day. I have 2 sons in our business, and they really run the business day to day. We have a lady who is actually family office, and she runs all the day-to-day administrations there. I give them ideas. I drive them crazy. And that's to stay engaged, to set objectives, and to be productive. And you can't achieve. I remember when I was running, what really embarrassed me when I run through the neighborhood, after a mile, I remember where I used to be, and I'm not anywhere close to that now.
Yeah.
You slow down in life, and in your business, you slow down. So give the baton to the next guy, let him do it, but you be an encourager and try to move businesses forward. Mm-hmm. In our family office, we have 7 or 8 different businesses. They're totally unrelated businesses, different businesses, from technology to a sports business. And to stay engaged and to stay with those people. And as you get older in life, it's your attitude. Mm-hmm. And Kate, I like hanging out with you. I've been looking forward to this for 2 or 3 days. I like to be around people like yourself that are young, you're eager, and you're trying to do great things. If you're around those level of people, I don't want to be around 80-year-old people.
That's great.
I can still remember that night in that office building where we were, and how young the people were, and they thought, "Who is this old man? What's he doing here?"
No, it was great. They were all there because of that old man was there. So, it was great.
So it's really back to what my mother said when I was 7 or 8 years old. Who you select to be your friend. So. I want to be with people that want to go somewhere, that are not negative in that want to set goals and try things and fail and not let failure bother you. I've made so many mistakes. I've been on the wrong horse many times. Yeah. And you know, when it explodes, you're still alive. You're in great shape.
I love it. I love it. My last question for you. This is a fun one. If you could speak to your younger self, what advice would you give yourself based on what you know now?
What I know now is to be a little more, when I grew up, I was very reserved. And when I went to Baylor, I did fairly good at Baylor and had fun, but I didn't show leadership. And I didn't really mature till I went to Michigan State. Can I tell a small story?
Please, absolutely.
I graduated from Baylor early, and I graduated in December when my class was graduating in the spring in May. And so the dean let me come to Michigan State, and my class had 72 people in there, and they had the fall semester. So when I got there in January, it was their second semester. Well, most of the men in the class were in their late 20s, early 30s, had a lot of business experience. Well, one of the classes I was in was in a seminar discussion class, and there was 10 or 12 in there. About 2 weeks or so into the class, when the professor came in the class, he said, "McLane, when the class is over, I want to talk to you." I thought he's going to really brag on me because I'd just gotten there, and he's going to say, "You're sure doing a good job." He said, "I've just been observing you, and you're adding no participation in this class. You're adding no value to this class. You're a graduate student, and I don't think you're working at a graduate level. And I'm going to give you 2 weeks to either improve dramatically, or I'm going to ask the dean to dismiss you from school." I thought, man, I've come 1,000 miles, and this guy's chewed me out. Yeah. I don't want to tuck tail and have to go home and say, "Boy, he didn't make it." So I became very assertive, or started getting into it. And he let me stay, and I did okay. We need to be kicked in the rear end. So have you ever been in the rear end? Somebody? And so I got that swift kick, and I thought, if I had used that skill the 4 years at Baylor, I would have advanced a little faster. Didn't. I was very reserved. Were you ever reserved?
I don't think so. I think I was pretty much born this way.
Shy. And it took this professor
Yeah.
to get me going.
Mm.
So we all need a swift kick along the way.
Yeah, that's good. Drayton, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate all your time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and for your thoughtful answers. I have no doubt that our audience is going to learn a tremendous amount when they listen to this episode. So thank you for taking time to be with me today.
Can I say go Bears?
I'm going to edit that part out, okay?
Hey, you're in charge, so you have. But I knew I'd get a smile out of your face.
Thank you, Drayton.
Go Red Raiders.